Roosevelt's second term, beginning in 1907, of course, he is going to propose a whole new batch of much more progressive policies. He's going to demand an 8-hour workday for workers, compensation for people injured on the job, inheritance tax, so wealthy people can't simply pass massive fortunes on to their kids, and an income tax that taxes the wealthy more than the poor. He's also going to call for government regulation of the stock market. Now, the conservatives and most Republicans really don't like this. Remember, they tend to be the party of business and the wealthy and believe in staying out of regulating businesses. And so the Republicans will revolt, and the party will split between Republicans who stay loyal to Roosevelt and Republicans who follow the more traditional Republican approach. Teddy's own party, the Republicans in Congress, will block his agenda. He will be unable to get these things through, even the Republican Senate. Roosevelt will also use his executive power, so he doesn't need the Senate's help. He does it simply as an order from the president, to set aside millions of acres of land in conservation. This land is mainly in the West, and the idea is this land should be saved. It should be spared from development, from oil drilling or lumber companies coming in and chopping down the wood. In 1907, congressional Republicans pass a law to stop him from doing this, but Roosevelt just simply seizes virtually all the public domain land, wild land in the country before the law officially goes into effect. So they pass the law, but the law has 60 or 90 days before it goes into effect, so he just seizes all the land before the law happens, and therefore it's legal. Roosevelt becomes a great champion of the conservation movement, and in fact, this is really the birth of modern conservation. He appoints Gifford Pinchot to be the chief forester for the United States, and these two will become a powerful team to protect much of the natural beauty of America, particularly in the West where it hadn't yet been spoiled. Conservatives actually support Teddy Roosevelt's National Reclamation Act, which builds dams using federal money to irrigate the West, and later those dams will provide electricity to the West as well. But nobody knew that at the time. Roosevelt supports the environment simply for beauty's sake. Roosevelt was a great outdoorsman, and he very much loved going into the West and into the mountains and into the valleys. So there isn't yet a sense that there is environmental value to these things. We're still simply protecting them because they're pretty. The real father of this movement, though, is John Muir. Now, I mentioned John Muir earlier. This is a Scottish immigrant who comes to America and falls in love, particularly with the Yosemite Valley, and that's the Yosemite Valley there in California. And he will live there. He'll tie himself up to the top of a tree to see what it's like to live through a storm. He'll go over a waterfall in a barrel to see what it's like to be water going over a waterfall. And he'll write passionately and go around the country and argue that we must protect the wildlands. And he'll meet Teddy Roosevelt, and Teddy Roosevelt will be very taken with him. Down here in the bottom picture in front of the big tree, you see Muir and Roosevelt, and then the two of them here also on the bottom left. And Muir will convince Roosevelt that these lands had to be saved. And that will be the beginning. The National Park System technically begins under Lincoln, but it's very small. It will expand dramatically under Teddy Roosevelt. One great example of this is the Hetchy Hetchy Valley. This is in Yosemite. San Francisco needs water, and one way they could do that is to dam up the Hetchy Hetchy Valley. The environmentalists, of course, want to protect the valley, arguing that it's very beautiful. You see it on the top left, untouched. In 1906, San Francisco is devastated by an earthquake and a major fire, and sympathy leads Gifford Pinchot, the chief forester, to approve the dam. Muir and the environmentalists fight back. Muir actually gets it on the ballot in the state of California, but the voters vote to go ahead and dam up the valley. The dam actually doesn't get built until after World War I, but this is a great example of the fight between using nature to benefit mankind, in this case the city of San Francisco to have water, versus preserving nature for its natural beauty. So that's just a little story to highlight this. In 1907, the economy collapses. Conservatives blame Teddy Roosevelt and the progressives. Roosevelt vows he will not interfere with the economy. There's this idea that because the government had begun to regulate the economy, that had caused the collapse. J.P. Morgan, the great capitalist, industrialist, will actually prop up the banks with his own money. Roosevelt agrees to allow Morgan to buy up smaller companies to keep them from going out of business to prevent the collapse. Now, this normally would be illegal because of rules against monopolies, but in this financial crisis, we turn to Morgan and we allow him to violate the rules on monopolies. Roosevelt had pledged when he won what turned out to be the only election he won, the 1904 election for president, that he would not run for a third term. Of course, by now, conservative Republicans don't want him. He's turned out to be quite liberal. And in fact, he probably could have gotten more votes running as a Democrat in 1908. But he retires, living up to his promise not to run for a third term in 1908. Now, Roosevelt will handpick William Howard Taft. Taft had administered the Philippines after the Spanish-American War and had been a long-time Republican Party regular. Roosevelt believed that Taft was a progressive, very much like Teddy. Conservative Republicans believed he was a conservative Republican. The conservatives were right. He beat William Jennings Bryan, who will lose his third attempt to become president in 1908, his third and final attempt. And Taft's term will destroy the Republican Party in the short term anyway. Taft calls Congress into session to lower the tariff. The conservatives say he's violating the separation of powers. The Constitution gives the president the right to call Congress into session and dismiss Congress, but it's rarely ever done. So when Taft calls him in, that becomes that upsets a lot of people. What Congress produces is the weak Payne-Aldrich tariff, which barely lowers the rate at all. It's really ineffectual. Taft upsets progressives by replacing the conservationist Secretary of the Interior with a corporate lawyer named Richard Ballinger, who tries to give 1 million acres of the land that Teddy Roosevelt had set aside to private developers so they could turn a profit on it. Investigation into this finds corruption. It turns out that Ballinger, the corporate lawyer, had been bribed in order to give this land to these private corporations. Taft ignores the findings and refuses to do anything about it, to fire Ballinger, for example. Gifford Pinchot asked Congress to investigate into it, and so Taft fires Pinchot when he demands action over this corrupt deal. Conservatives investigate and claim there was no wrongdoing, but of course they didn't like preserving the land anyway. But after this point, Taft has no more allies on the progressive side of the aisle. All he has left are the conservative Republicans, who really, honestly, aren't that comfortable with him either. Roosevelt, after he retires, goes to Africa and Europe for a nice long trip of vacation. But in 1910, he returns to America and turns on William Howard Taft, the man he had handpicked to be president after him. He goes around the country on a big speaking tour, attacking Taft and explaining why he's a terrible president. Roosevelt, in typical Roosevelt fashion, decides that there's only one man who can save America, Teddy Roosevelt. And he comes up with a plan he calls the New Nationalism. He says the government now must be viewed as a steward of the citizens, as the protector of the regular people. He demands a graduated income tax, an inheritance tax, workers' compensation for injuries, regulation of labor, lower tariffs, and strong regulations of corporations. This is very liberal. He is extremely progressive at this point. The progressives who support Roosevelt sweep the congressional elections in 1910 and throw the Republicans out. The Democrats now control the House for the first time since 1894. Roosevelt claims he's not running for president, but is just trying to pressure Taft to move to the left and become more progressive. Taft sues Roosevelt, the Roosevelt administration, over letting Morgan prop up the economy by violating monopoly laws. Roosevelt gets angered by this. Roosevelt throws his support behind Robert La Follette, the extremely progressive governor of Wisconsin. But La Follette loses, I believe it's his daughter. She dies, and La Follette has a nervous breakdown and decides he can't run for president because of personal issues. Roosevelt, with La Follette out, decides to run himself. Roosevelt wins every Republican primary. There's only 13 at the time, but Roosevelt wins them all by a landslide. The party leaders, though, the actual people who run the Republican Party, don't want Roosevelt. He's basically a Democrat. They want Taft. Roosevelt goes to the convention, and he's easily winning the convention. But the leaders at the convention begin to change the rules to ensure that Taft will get the nomination. Taft does get the nomination. Roosevelt walks out of the convention and says he's going to run as a third-party candidate. He says, when he's asked if he can be president, that he's as fit as a bull moose. And so we call it the Bull Moose Party. But technically its name was the Progressives.